We actually got to hit a loan, actually got both steps. And told me up.
Your neighbor is not gonna be happy when I pass along to him. It explains he's gonna have to.
Right.
Yeah, but he's gonna have to cut him down.
Well, and that's the reason, I felt that's more than you know, where the.
Then I got it. I'm driving.
Yeah.
Dogs and they had. Address that and ask one more dog. See that less cats. That's what he was saying.
Yeah.
The other thing, by vaccination, all that, what's in there, would be the. Yeah, we're getting on ballot.
Good choice on this,
Tipped
Jennifer.
and all that.
Yeah, to identify.
I haven't had them before.
We had one time.
A bubbler. It's triple berry breezer.
She worked under Paul.
No sugar, no artificial sweeteners. Sparkling water.
Yeah, there you
It actually is.
Yeah.
Where would you like it to be basically?
Yeah, that's gonna be a tough conversation. Oh. No, you need to see this one. Yeah, we're actually working with them and in drafting. We gotta see it, so.
That's a problem. Like, can't think of her name. She worked at Humane Society. She worked over in Arlington. She's a gal.
This is.
That's it.
Yeah,
She worked actually down to the Humane Society. And then it's.
All right, we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. Opens Meeting Act is posted on the rear wall next to the agendas. We will start with roll call for the city council.
Von Barrett,
yes.
Sucre. Yep. Jensen,
Here.
Lakra,
Here.
Deanna. Vaughn,
Here.
Ellis. Jenkins. Five council members are there.
Okay. And I do not believe we have a quorum for the planning commission, so we have 4 members present. They're welcome again to and be a part of the meeting and interact. Again, this is just a study session, no formal action will be taken. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and turn it over to item 3. It's a presentation regarding Nebraska Community Development Law, including blight and substandard declarations, redevelopment plans, tax increment financing, enhanced employment areas, and property assessed clean energy districts. And we're here today with Michael Sands, an attorney with Baird Home Law Firm. With Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you to introduce Michael.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'll introduce Michael Sands. Michael is an attorney with Baird Home. He received his bachelor's degree from the greatest university on earth, the University of Kansas. And his law degree from the University of Nebraska. His practice focuses on real estate, construction, tax increment financing, occupation tax, municipal bonds, and renewable energy. I will stick through a lot of this, but he represents municipalities acting as special counsel for projects utilizing tax increment financing, general business occupation tax, other alternative financing mechanisms. And he serves on the board of directors for the Nebraska Housing Development Association. And he has been selected by his peers for inclusion in the best lawyers in America Wants to Watch. So welcome, Michael.
Sounds a lot more impressive. Appreciate it all. Stand up. Well, when you get tired, then we'll sit down, but thank you, Jennifer, for the nice introduction. So as Jennifer said, you know, I do a lot of things in my practice, but one of the main things probably about 60% of my time is on municipal incentives, like tax increment financing. It's one of the things that I'll talk about. So Jennifer reached out just to give this presentation, give a little bit of 101. She gave me a little bit of context and background about what the city has going on. So I'll hit on some relevant, some other relevant items as well. But certainly, this is for your benefit, not, my ego to hear myself talk. So I'd much prefer if you have a question, just speak up and we can make this conversation that usually goes. It's a lot better experience for everybody when it's that way. So what I'll first go through and I don't know, we X that out maybe.
Tyler, is there a way to,
If not, that's fine. It's just, you'll probably cover up some of the title, but I think people will just a bit of you. So I'll start out with kind of some tip 101. Those are just the items I'll go through. I'll try, like I said, just have a conversation and not look up at the platform too much. But the 5 items are kind of the 5 natural steps or kind of elements of TIF, which is community redevelopment authorities, which would be your CBAs or CRAs, then get into community redevelopment areas, which are divided into standard areas, and then just kind of the elements of that approval process for TIF, which are plans, contracts, and then the actual issuance. So in any of these kind of TIF 101 presentations, I find this illustration to be helpful because it's just a visual of how TIF operates. And so with this, I like to think of that bottom green line across the bottom there as like a vacant piece of land, just, an underutilized piece of land, not collecting very much in property tax. Obviously, if it's vacant, it doesn't have improvements on it, so you're just collecting a little, the valuation isn't very high, collecting very little property tax on it. And for purposes of this, we'll say it's already within a blighted and substandard area. The city's already designated that area as blighted and substandard. So you have a developer or the city itself would come in and say, hey, I want to do a project in this on this vacant tract. I want to build an office building, let's say. Right now, the valuation of that parcel is, we'll call it $100,000. So that $100,000 or the tax levy on that $100,000 is that green line. That's that baseline value that's being collected on that vacant parcel. But what the developer or city is proposing is once we come in and build that commercial office space, it's going to go up from $100,000 valuation to $1 million. And so what you do is you project, okay, it's 100,000 now. We think it's going to be $1 million once the project is built. So then you have a $900,000 delta or that increment in between what it is now, where we think it's going to go. And that forms the basis of what could potentially be awarded in TIF. And that calculation, it's a pretty easy one. If you think it's going to be worth $1 million, it's worth 100 now. You have that 900,000 delta. You just multiply that by the levy rate, the full levy rate of the county, with all the taxing entities, city, county, schools, all those things. So you multiply it by that 900,000, and then presumably, if you're doing a 15-year TIF, you multiply that by 15, and that would kind of give you your estimated amount of tax increment financing that could be collected over that 15-year period. And that's what that blue area above the green line represents. So for, let's say, a TIF project is approved, that example that we outlined, then for 15 years, once the project is built and the taxes start to be divided, that increase or that delta can go back to the developer to pay off eligible costs. And I'll get in a little bit more to what eligible costs are, but typically what we're talking about in a very general sense are true public infrastructure improvements like roads, streets, sewers, waters, sidewalks, things like that, anything really within the public right of way. But then also improvements that just confer a general public benefit, like, you know, facade enhancements or landscaping, things like that, that could, well, not, you know, truly public infrastructure. They eliminate some of the blighted characteristics of the area. And so, you know, during that 15-year period, you'll notice that that green line remains the same. That's because that, you know, the taxes collected on that base valuation or that $100,000 always continues to go back to the taxing jurisdiction. So all those levying jurisdictions, the county, the city, the, you know, the schools, fire, things like that, they still collect on that $100,000, while the rest, that increment, goes to the developer. And then, of course, at the end of the TIF term, whether it's the 15-year period, or it could be less than that if the TIF note is paid off in full before that 15 years, then the TIF would shut off early. Obviously, then it's a windfall to all of the taxing jurisdictions. They get the full benefit of that increase after that 15 years or after the indebtedness is paid off. And so, you know, and it might be on a future slide, but one of the fundamental tenets of TIF, and why I would say that that's a windfall, is because, you know, in order to approve TIF, one of the key determinations that needs to be made or addressed is that, but for this benefit that the developer is receiving, that this project wouldn't occur. So you're saying, you know, if it weren't for TIF, there's some gap in financing that needs to be filled. These days, it's pretty hard to, or it's pretty easy to find those gaps with how high interest rates are, how high, you know, construction costs are. So what, you know, most everything that's getting built these days is getting built with incentives. So it's pretty easy now, but it's something that needs to be looked at as part of every project. So you're saying, you know, but for receiving that tax increment back for the 15 years to help fund this project, you know, you're at risk, or you probably would be at risk of having that green line just remain static for that 15 years. And instead of the end of the 15 years, you get all of this green and it all goes to the taxing jurisdictions. You're just going to have that vacant, you know, tract there for an indefinite period of time, because for whatever reason, it's too expensive or difficult or whatever it might be to develop. Any questions just on the bills that
I do have a little on that. I mean, you're talking about a 15-year TIF now. This 15-year, that's new. That's new as of the last election, correct? I mean, before it was always TIF.
You're thinking of 20 years. So it's been 15 years, I think, since the 70s, since it was.
But I know it jumped 5. So it jumped 5 years the last election.
Yeah, so the last general election, they did a constitutional amendment to allow, in certain circumstances, to increase it from 15 to 20 years. Those circumstances are that to qualify for 20 years, an area needs to meet criteria kind of
over and above
blighted and substandard. It's called extremely blighted. And really what that means is you have all of this criteria for blighted and substandard. I mean, there's like 17 different factors. What extremely blighted focuses on is like pure census data, like income, or, you know, the poverty rate or below median income rate, and unemployment rate. Those are the two primary things that you look at for extremely blighted. In my experience, outside of some pockets in, like, you know, Lincoln, Omaha, perhaps Fremont, none in Fremont. Have you looked into it? It's very hard. It's very hard criteria to meet unless it's a very densely populated area.
I think that the poverty rate has to be 150% of the statewide poverty rate, and unemployment rate similar.
Well, that just being on the ballot list, and I just seen that do we really need 5 more years of TIF? Is that really something that's, and I just wanted to, is that something that will be settled in If these are the
Yeah.
criteria that you're saying, probably not.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
there's
it's,
just a few census tracts in Lincoln, Omaha.
it's like
and
North
Scotts
Omaha,
Bluff.
South Omaha, downtown Omaha, and then maybe like Air Park in Lincoln and a couple of smaller
Yeah, a couple
areas in
in
Lincoln.
Scotts Bluff.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good question. So I'll just jump into those points on the first slide. And if there are any questions along the way, again, don't hesitate to speak up. So I'll start with just the governance aspect of it, which is the Community Redevelopment Authority. As I say in the slide, that can come in three forms, which is a community development agency, a community redevelopment authority, and a limited community redevelopment authority. Really, the community redevelopment authority and community development agency are the typical ones that you'll see. Fremont has a CDA or CRA, CDA, right? Okay. So that is by far the most common one. And does the council act? The council does act as the CDA. Sorry, I work with a lot of municipalities that they all get twisted up in my brain. So that is by far the most common setup. I think it's the most efficient setup, to be honest with you, to have the council act in those dual capacities. And really, and between those two, at least CRA and CDA, they have the exact same powers. The only difference between them is that a CRA is more like an appointed sort of volunteer body where you would appoint citizens outside of public servants or city staff to that for terms, whereas the CDA is usually just kind of a subsect of the city and made up of the council or some other folks within the city. As far as their powers, they're pretty broad, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but the statutes provide a lot of discretion to cities on how they want to implement or administer TIF, which is a great thing because it is one of the only, with the exception of a couple others, true local incentives that municipalities have at their disposal. Most of the others have a lot more state oversight or federal oversight, whatever it might be. This one's really, controlled at the local level. That's not to say that you can go outside the bounds of the statutes. You obviously have to stay within the boundaries of the law, but they give, pretty broad discretion within that. And you see that that's a direct quote from the statutes. An authority has all powers necessary or convenient to carry out and effectuate the purposes of the community development law. What I noted in there is, while that is true, there has to be parameters to exercise those powers. That's usually in the form of, passing a redevelopment plan for a project. The authority can't just, go rogue and start buying up land or dividing taxes just because it has those broad powers. It has to be within, within the context of something that's ultimately been approved by the city council, which is the governing body of the authority. So in that same vein, the CDA has the authority to levy a property tax up to 2.6 cents. Again, that would need to, did you have a question?
No, I just.
Sorry. That would have to be within the context of being approved in a redevelopment plan. They couldn't just go out and say, we're going to levy a tax and use it for a slush fund towards, redevelopment. But it does have that taxing authority, which a lot of folks aren't aware of. And like most things, any action requires a majority vote. Touched on this a little bit already. So community redevelopment areas, otherwise known as blighted and substandard areas. Obviously, blighted and substandard sounds pretty scary. It's often kind of scoffed at, or folks worry about it when maybe they're an area where their home is in or business is deemed or being considered as being designated as blighted and substandard. Really, all it is just a weighing of some statutory criteria. So along with some of that census data that we talked about for extremely blighted, like I said, I can't remember the exact number. It's like 15 or 17 different criteria in the statute. And a lot of it is what I would call kind of drive-by survey criteria, meaning what do the streets look like? What do the sidewalks look like? What do the conditions of the buildings look like? Are they dilapidated? Are they in good condition? What's the age of those structures? What's the platting like for the area? Does it make sense for development? Kind of things like that. So a lot of it, it's a good mix of kind of subjective and objective. And there's no hard and fast rule in the statutes about, well, you have to meet 10 out of 16 criteria. There's about, I want to say 12 blighted criteria and 3 or 4 substandard criteria. And it's really just kind of a common sense or use your gut determination. If you're relying on one, tiny piece of criteria from both the blighted and substandard side, well, maybe you might want to scrutinize that decision a little bit, but ultimately, these aren't just one parcel. It isn't just one parcel most of the time. You're looking at, a collection of a lot of parcels. So you just kind of have to weigh the factors among all of those parcels, and really just use common sense whether you think it's a good use of that designation, because ultimately it's not hard to meet that criteria if you're drawing the boundary lines big enough for around certain things.
I have a question. How many areas do we have that are blighted?
We have downtown, the North Broad Street area, Morningside, north side of Morningside, the south side of Morningside, by the Nelson Business Park. There's an area just south of the railroad tracks around Christensen Lumber, the area by Costco and Holstone. And that also includes that whole area along Old 275 between that and kind of the Proctor Dunbar area. And you can only have 35%.
Yeah. So for Fremont, it'd be 35%. It depends on the class of city. So villages can do 100%. And then it's just step downs from there based on the class of city. Fremont would be
35% of what?
The entire land area within the municipal boundaries. But ultimately, I mean, like I said, this is a TIF is a financing tool, but it's equal parts economic development, and cities are able to shape development by drawing these boundaries in areas that need development, where they want development. Certainly you have to meet the statutory criteria, but it really is up to the cities where they offer this incentive most of the time. A lot of the time developers will come in and say, we want to do a project here. Can you look at blighting it? And certainly cities in most cases are willing to work with them on that if it makes sense. But ultimately it's the city's decision, obviously subject to meeting that criteria.
Michael, are you going to get into kind of the proactive examples and then some reactive examples of
as far as
TIF?
In what sense? Just as far as the city undertaking it first?
Yeah, if the city undertakes a project or what they say they want to be included in the project for public improvements versus a developer coming in and saying, I want this, and the city just saying, okay, sure, fine, you can have.
Yeah, I can't recall if it's in there or not, but I might as well just go over it. So yeah, I mean, there are kind of two different scenarios, I think there's two parts to that question. So one part might be that the city itself might be spearheading a project, which is not uncommon. I work on a lot of projects across the state, helping municipalities do just that, especially for workforce and affordable housing. And so obviously when they're doing that, they control the show as far as what they're developing. But I think what you're getting at more is that, so most often it's going to be privately driven as far as projects are concerned. You're going to have a developer coming in saying, we want to do this, and they're going to be asking for TIF. And certainly, you know, it's a balancing act, right? Because in most cases, development is good as long as it's the right kind of development the city wants to see. But also the city does have leverage in those situations to undertake maybe or require the developer to undertake some things that the city would like to see done. As opposed to maybe just what the developer presents. Omaha is kind of the master of this. It's kind of our way or the highway. We need you to put in new curb cuts, new sidewalk. You have to do this and this and this and this as a condition of receiving the TIF. And certainly there's typically some negotiation in that, because you know what one side wants might not work for the other side, but oftentimes the result of it is that the city, aside from having a site developed, can receive a great deal of benefit from these projects by having the developers implement those public improvements that otherwise would be the burden of the tax base. They'd be, passed on to, they'd be billed with city funds and then passed through as taxes to the general public.
A couple examples in Lincoln, they'll have a certain percentage of the amount of the TIF set aside for streetscape improvements, sidewalk improvements, road improvements, landscaping, bike lanes, public plazas, parks, those kind of things. I think Omaha has done some similar things, require enhanced or higher design guidelines for the buildings that go up. To say, if you want to use this, we agree that it's an economic benefit to the city, but we want these enhancements in this area as a part of the project.
Yep. So great example. Just as a rule, in Omaha and to a certain extent Lincoln as well, you automatically have to abide by the highest design guidelines of the city. So you can't, no matter what you're building, if you want TIF, you can't use that, really cruddy siding on whatever you're building. It's gonna have to meet, the design criteria, the highest design criteria that might exist for, some of the, whatever the cherished corridors are in the city where they actually have those design criteria or the overlay areas. Which is basically just saying, we're not going to help you finance a crummy project. It needs to be of the highest quality.
When you say that, is that specific to the different cities, or is that up to the planning commission?
Yeah, so that would just be, it is up ultimately to the city council to put those policies in place. It's not something, so it's something that you want to be consistent across the board and actually adopt a written policy for it so that you're applying it consistently and not on a project by project basis where it could be perceived as favoritism if one has to abide by it but not the other. But yeah, that's within kind of that broad discretion and authority that cities have to implement these programs, is that so long as they do so in a equal manner, they can implement those kind of policies. And you could do so at your next council meeting, and then all TIF applications going forward have to meet those policies. Certainly they're living, breathing documents a lot of the time, and they need refinement, especially based on market conditions, or just generally what the city wants to see with it. But many cities implement those, and it's at the council level that would implement it.
But it would start with the planning commission and the CDA, and then the city council to talk about how it fits in within the comprehensive plan, and then which is the planning commission's role, and then the CDA and the council's role is to then establish those policies.
Yeah, so and that would be more redevelopment plan, but even with these policies, I would certainly recommend I've done quite a few of these with communities I work with. I always tell them, you know, even though you could just take it straight to the council, definitely involve all of the agencies that have a stake in TIF, so that, you know, everybody's bought into this policy, can provide their input on it, and so on. So did that answer your question, Jennifer? Okay. So just jumping back into the slide. So once you have a blighted area, and you know, we went over this a little bit in the overview. The next logical step would be a redevelopment project would be brought to the city, or the city would initiate one itself. That's usually done via, you know, an application process. And assuming the city wants to move forward, they would implement the information in that application into what's called a redevelopment plan. Now, so a redevelopment plan can be general or project specific in nature. What I mean by that is, you could, you know, say you just blighted in an area in a part of the city that you really want to see developed out for a certain specific purpose, say an industrial park. Well, you could go ahead, even though you don't have developers coming in proposing projects yet, the city could, once that area is blighted, put what's called a general plan in place that basically says, look, if you want to receive TIF within this area, it needs to be within these parameters. It's not going to spell out in the, like it does in the project specific plans, about how much TIF is authorized or things like that, or the specifics of the project, because you don't know any of that yet, but it can set broader parameters of how we're going to use TIF in that area.
And that's what we have here in Fremont, is we have very broad general redevelopment plans for our redevelopment areas. And then when somebody is proposing a project, we go back in and amend that redevelopment plan for the specific project. The Planning Commission reviews that for conformity with the comprehensive plan. And then the CDA and the City Council determine and approve the specific TIF contract, approve the redevelopment plan and the agreement and so forth.
Yeah, you bet. So the plan itself, you know, you have a plan, a redevelopment plan and a redevelopment contract or agreement, which I'll get into next, but the plan is exactly that. It's not a contract. It does not obligate the city to do anything. Doesn't obligate the developer to do anything. What it does is it sets the parameters of what TIF can be used for. So in this sense, I'm talking more project specific and not general. What you know, it sets forth what the project is, what it'll involve, where it is, what the TIF can be used for, how much we think it'll generate in TIF. Based on that, how much TIF could be awarded to the developer. So it really just sets forth those parameters. And that's when you get beyond the plan stage, the contract stage, or even to the construction stage and so on, you can't violate those parameters of the plan. You can't say, well, we're going to build this and then build something else and still receive TIF for it. So while it isn't a contract, by law, you can't, you know, do something completely outside of it and still be eligible for TIF, because it's really just kind of the governing sort of overarching document for that project that permits the use of TIF for that project from a kind of a statutory state law standpoint, as opposed to like a contractual standpoint. And so as far as, and I included, you know, what some of those eligible uses can be, like I said, it can vary by community. It kind of goes with that discretion, but also just because there's only a few items that are very specifically listed out in the statute, so it's kind of open for interpretation. But the things that are 100% included within the eligible costs among all communities is acquisition and site preparation, including demolition, grading, special foundations, environmental remediation, public improvements. So that's where we're talking about those right-of-way costs, along with parks, public parking. And then it specifically says enhancements to structures that exceed minimum building or design standards. That is specifically in the statute. So, you know, that's a tricky one in Omaha because they already say TIF already has to be the highest of design standards, right? So they very seldom will give developers that because they already say you already have to meet the highest. But if you don't have that in place and say, you know, according to your ordinary design standards or building standards, you only, you know, you can use some sort of synthetic facade for the building, but the developer wants to build it with brick or stone. Well, under the statute, you could give them the difference in that because they're using such a higher quality material up to higher design standards than what's really required, which makes sense because they are, you know, they're guarding against kind of that blighted designation or returning to that kind of blighted designation, the more quality they put into the project. Repair or rehabilitation work to existing structures. That's directly in the statute. I hesitate to say it's the same across all communities because it's not. Lincoln, for example, is a little bit different on rehab. And what we're talking about is you have an existing building, you're going in and, you know, the bones of the building will remain, so you're not knocking it down, you're just completely rehabbing it. In most communities, you know, any of that kind of structural rehab work that's not, you know, purely aesthetic. So we're not talking about, you know, granite countertops or things like that, but to actually kind of reconfigure a building and rehab it, most communities treat that as eligible, about like 99% of them. And then professional fees. So my fees, engineering fees, architecture fees, surveys, things like that. You always have to make sure that all the statutes include a lot of criteria that needs to be in a plan. So of course you have to be careful to make sure that all the plans that you pass have that. It's pretty succinctly laid out, so it's not hard to miss if you read the statutes. And then, like I talked about before, that but-for analysis that the project presented, and I will say presented, we're not talking about any project, or we're not talking about some version of the project presented. The statute really, you know, pretty straightforwardly says, you know, the project presented. So whatever the developer is presenting would not occur or wouldn't be economically feasible without some assistance via the TIF. So as far as the plan steps, I got into this a little bit. So it would start with a TIF application. And Jennifer, I think, kind of just reviewed this as well, that, you know, the next step once an application is received would be to turn it into the plan. Once the plan is drafted, then it would go to the authority. Well, I could go to, do you send it to the authority to the planning commission, or you just route it straight to the planning commission?
We run it straight to the planning commission.
And it can be done both ways. I typically advise that just to do so administratively to make it easier. So once the plan is completed, it would go to the planning commission, who holds a public hearing on conformance with the comprehensive plan, and then makes a recommendation to the city council. Then it would go to the authority, who reviews the plan for certain statutory criteria that mainly have to do with financials and the use of TIF, and it specifically spells out in the statutes what that is. And they also are recommending authorities, so they make a recommendation to the council on the plan. Then ultimately the council holds a public hearing and makes a determination whether to approve or not approve the plan. So that whole process, you know, it really just depends on scheduling for those three bodies about how, you know, quick or long that takes. General rule of thumb is usually about 2 months to 2.5 months. Or as quick as 1 month, depending on, you know, if you're going to schedule special meetings among those bodies. But at the very least, it's going to take you about 3 weeks to notice everything, so.
Can I touch on the notification requirements?
Yeah.
The notification requirements are huge. So before planning commission, you have to notice in the paper 2 weeks in a row. The second one has to be at least 10 days in advance. So that's putting you more than 2 weeks out for notification for both planning commission. And then you have to do the same thing for city council. And the Fremont Tribune's deadlines are for a month. To advertise on a Thursday, I have to have the ad in on Monday. So that adds to the time of the project too. But those notification requirements are important. And then also we have to send certified letters to all of the taxing entities. Let them know about the project.
Yep. Yeah, it can get pretty detailed. So yes, I think about half of my municipal clients, their favorite thing I do for them is just put together a schedule of when all that stuff needs to happen, because it's a lot of moving parts. So once the plan is approved, like I said, the plan is the governing document. The contract is the actual contract between the city and the developer. Really, at its foundation, it's all, it's saying, a city will grant you this award of TIF and pay out that increment for up to 15 years in return for you, constructing the project that you've laid out in the redevelopment plan, and doing any other things that might be stipulated as part of that project. Certainly, there's a lot of other more legalese provisions in there, but they are important. Obviously it can provide deadlines. Sometimes cities want to be a little more flexible on that, just because they don't want to go back. They want to provide some flexibility, so they don't have to go back and amend it if it's a day late on delivering that project. So there can be some flexibility, but certainly there can be hard deadlines in there as well. Representations and warranties that the developer will abide by the law, has the authority to do everything that they're saying, has the financial means to do what they're saying. An important one is a provision that you'll put in there that prohibits the developer from contesting the assessed valuation below the estimated valuation. Yeah.
That was my question. Once he's locked in then, and how long is he locked in?
Well, typically it would only be for the life of the contract, because really the city's carrot in all of this is the TIF. So, once the TIF is run out, presumably they, after that 15 years, they could go back and try to protest that. But at that point, if it's been at that level for so long, they're going to have a very hard time protesting it below that level.
Because they're getting the benefits for the 14 years then.
Right. And I mean, that protects both the developer and the city, because the developer, they might sell the project or, have other folks that are partial owners that might want to protest that because they're not getting the valuation of the TIF. The developer wants it to be at that valuation so they can get that revenue stream for the 15 years. But more importantly, on the city side, if, you don't want to allow somebody to come in. The best example of this I've seen was in Sydney. Cabela's had a ton of property, that occupied that space in that city. And Cabela's did a lot of TIF projects there. And when Bass Pro came in, they wanted to protest their valuation down and down and down. They didn't want to pay all those property taxes. But obviously those provisions were in those contracts. I mean, the end of the story is Bass Pro tried to do it anyway, but that's an aside. But that can save the city and the developer in those circumstances where you just have somebody come in that doesn't really have a stake in the TIF. They don't care if those promises are broken. So that's the way to enforce.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So. Beyond that, certainly limits the authorities and cities' liability. The TIF is, and we're talking about, you know, private development TIF. Certainly if the city is taking on the project itself, they're gonna have, you know, some liability and financial stake in the game. But in projects that are privately developed, the authority and the city really have no liability other than to pay out the TIF, so long as obviously the developer is not in breach of the redevelopment contract. The city does not put up its full faith and credit to make payments on that TIF. The TIF note or bond that is issued is only backed or secured by that increment. Whatever the city receives in that increment for the county, they'll pay out on the note. If it's more than, you know, what would be in a normal amortization, great, it'll pay off quicker. If it's less than that, well, too bad. After 15 years, you're gonna have to forgive the shortfall. And it's on the developer if, you know, to make that up to their lender if they've monetized it, or to just eat that loss if they haven't. Unlike the plan, it is not as complicated to approve a contract. It can just be at a single meeting that does not require a public hearing or special notices. Then the last step would be bond or promissory note issuance. You'll see them be called both either bonds or notes. They're always the same exact thing. They're going to read the same. What they are, they're promissory notes. They're not a municipal bond. Like I said, they are only backed by the increment that the city receives, not the city's full faith and credit like you would typically see in a municipal bond or their taxing ability. So they're really just promissory notes. They can be issued 30 days after authorized, or it's smart to wait 30 days after being authorized. That's because there's a remonstrance period, which basically says, you know, once authorized, once 30 days passes, it requires a very high burden of proof to challenge the legality of those notes or bonds or any of the things that came before it, like the plan or the contract, things like that. They're often, in most cases, issued almost immediately. So, you know, obviously you want to wait those 30 days, but soon thereafter, the developer will often want those issued pretty quickly, because what they want to do is they want to turn around and get a private loan from a lender and put that note up as collateral on that loan. Because bear in mind, what we're talking about here with TIF is a financing gap, right? They need money for that upfront financing of the construction. So most often they can't just pocket it and wait, you know, not only for the project to get built, but, you know, basically a year after that, because bear in mind the taxes are paid in arrears. So if you start dividing something, if you say that the taxes start being divided in 2024, you're not going to see those taxes till 2025. So most often they need to go out and monetize that note quickly with a bank instead of self-financing, holding on to it and doing it that way. That being said, if it is self-financed, which in some cases is done, it really can be issued at any time. Often, if that's the case, I'll just advise that it's issued once the project is complete, because you have a full kind of view of things. And again, like the contract, it's just approved at a single meeting of the authority after the redevelopment plan is approved. And oftentimes it will just be incorporated as part of that approval of the redevelopment contract. The redevelopment contract will attach it as an exhibit and will also authorize its issuance after the 30-day period. So that would kind of happen at the same time. So the last slide on that is just the roles. And we've already gone over this for the most part. Planning Commission, they are a recommending authority for both the blight designation and redevelopment plan approval. Both of those being related to conformance with the city's comprehensive plan. So that should really be the the main focus of the planning commission is looking at, does this project fit within the framework of the comprehensive plan? And that's what their recommendation should be based off of. The authority in general, it's kind of the gatekeeper and administrative body for the TIF. For agencies such as yours, where it's the council that acts as the authority, it's going to be a lot of it's going to be put on your administration and city staff to be that gatekeeper in most cases, which is perfectly fine and is the way it is in most places. They are the recommending authority for the redevelopment plan. They don't have a real role in that blight designation, but of course they do on the plan. And then often approves and enters into the redevelopment contract. I highlighted in there, the council can do that as well. It could be either body. In the end, the council is the governing body of the CDA. So the council, if it so chose, it could be their name on the contract. It's kind of 6 dozen or the other as far as that's concerned. And then the council, has that ultimate approval authority with respect to both blight designations and the redevelopment plans. And then as governing body of the authority, can exert control over the authority and exercise any powers of the authority. That's not really applicable to Fremont because they're the same bodies, CDA and council. But I've seen instances where that isn't the case, and there might be some disagreements between the bodies, such that impasses can occur. So ultimately, it's going to be the council that has a say on those impasses. And then, like I mentioned a couple times, in general, communities have very broad discretion and authority in relation to the use and administration of TIF. On my watch on, I just have no sense of how long we've been. 5:52. So I don't know. I don't want to outstay my welcome. I have these other incentives up here, and I also want to answer any questions people have. So I guess, what was the thought process on timing? I don't want to.
Yeah, I think we had you until 6. But
We definitely want to talk about the district
Yeah,
TIF and
definitely.
the enhanced
I think
deployment
it's a
areas.
valuable discussion right now, so.
Okay, I will try to be both quick and thorough to the extent that is possible. And certainly, again, please chime in. So that, as I mentioned at the outset, these are kind of some more pointed discussion points that Jennifer asked that maybe I touch on that would be helpful. So I assume there might be some questions, so please speak up if there are. So district TIF. District TIF is a term, I guess, that we arrived at in the last few years. It used to be called bucket TIF. That became a dirty word in the legislature, so now it's district TIF. So some communities, many communities across the state, many that I have worked with, employ district TIF programs to finance improvements or provide grants within the entirety of a community redevelopment area, as opposed to a single project site with a larger community redevelopment area. So this is it's similar in a sense to what we're talking about that with the general plan, in the sense that you're looking at an entire area. But where it's different is it goes above and beyond what we would have in that general plan, because you really are implementing kind of a project or a project plan, and you are dividing taxes. And how that's done is that the city would adopt a redevelopment plan, setting forth the uses of TIF within the area. And that can range from extremely specific, and the example on that is the Omaha streetcar. And the good thing about the streetcar, no matter how you think about it, it completely legitimized these district TIFs, because there's not, these things have been kind of flying under the radar for many years. And there was some concern legally where they fit in the statutes that, it was kind of a thing where we think it's abiding by the letter of the law, but it's hard to say where like the state auditor would fall on these things if they ever really wanted to look into it hard. not the case anymore. The Omaha streetcar is a complete district TIF. It's obviously very publicized, and they have actually implemented legislation into the statutes last year that authorized the division of TIF for what they call workable programs, which is district TIF.
Another example might be I think in Lincoln, they used it in the Haymarket district. For, some of the facade and the higher level design, street amenities, street furniture, landscaping, those sorts of things. They use the district TIF to put toward paying for those type of amenities.
A quick question. So the district TIF, would that count against the 35%, I believe you said, percentage for a city of our class and designation? Would go in the same bucket?
Yes, so it still has to be within a blighted and substandard area.
Yeah.
And then this would be kind of just a layer on top of that, but yeah, it would have to be within that area. And go towards it.
Within, once we already have declared, what percentage you would guesstimate we have already designated blighted subdivision?
What percentage of land in Fremont?
I think it's 28%.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And certainly that, that grows as the city, I don't know what the city's annexation plan looks like, but that it typically is always, that percentage is always changing based on annexation of the city. So it can be extremely specific, like the streetcar. Another one in Lincoln was Westo. They have one on Westo. And that one was very much more infrastructure related. But it can be very broad, and that's what what I will most often work with on communities is just the general sort of, look, our downtown is getting a little shabby. We really want to do something about it. We want to incentivize, businesses to do facade enhancements. We want to put in more benches. We want more green space. We'd love to have, a green space in the middle of the road and just things like that. Just generally, we want to brighten up our downtown, make it look better, and incentivize, better street lighting, things like that, by a loan of their very nature would improve the area.
Do you see it where you might have an older area just on the edge of town that you would bring into town and then be able to use that district TIF to pay for street paving or extension of sewer and water, that kind of thing?
Right, almost like an SID. Yep, we've done some of those. We've done it where you have a big subdivision, a residential subdivision that's going in, but the sewer capacity or the plant that would service that part of town, they basically have to upgrade the entire plant. So they'll do a district TIF within that entire residential subdivision, because the very basic infrastructure of sewer and water that would be needed to service that subdivision needs to be upgraded. So yeah, things like that. Yeah.
So then the neighbors get to pay for the TIF of that project then?
So yeah, so that final point addresses that. So how it works is the improvement. So financing for these improvements comes from the city dividing the tax on all properties within the area and collecting the natural increase in property taxes or valuations on those properties per 15-year period. So nobody's paying more in taxes. Everybody's paying the same amount of taxes they would ordinarily be paying. The difference is that instead of this, big uptick, what they're doing is say, this is the tax base within that entire area. Well, we know that, the typical kind of process or history will tell us that property valuations go up. That might be subtle, a lot more subtle than that, but typically, a general rule of thumb is year over year, 2% or somewhere around that. So it'll be more like a line like this, a very slim line, but it's also on a lot more properties. So there's a lot more valuation there. So that's how it would work, is that, you know, my house this year might be valued at $200,000. And, you know, next year, it might be $210,000. Well, that $10,000, you know, would go to the city, and so would my neighbors. Everybody within that area would go to that pool of funds to fund that redevelopment. Yeah.
Said earlier, though, if you're in a blighted area, and if it's a district. Like, if I live in that area, I have no invested interest in this. And my property valuation goes up. You might not have the right to contest it.
That is not the case with district TIFs. It would not, because you wouldn't be signing a contract with the city. So everybody's still, nobody, you know, no private citizens lose any rights that they would otherwise have. It is business as usual. But for the fact that whatever increase there ends up being, the city would collect that. Yeah.
But the city council then has to, in order to capture that, has to keep the levy at the same rate to capture that increase to pay off those TIF bonds.
Yeah, I mean, generally, so that obviously there would be political considerations in that. If you're going to hike up the levy rate, you know, right then, that's probably not a great idea. You're going to be, you know, people are going to be pissed about that.
But you don't want to
but you also don't want, you also don't want to. Typically, you know, all things being equal, you'd like it to remain pretty steady throughout that, because obviously the levy rate has as much of an impact on the tax revenues as you collect as anything. It can oftentimes overpower the, you know, any improvements or otherwise increases in values if that levy rate goes down considerably.
We got a question here.
Yeah.
Is the city virtually always the redeveloper in district TIFs?
So they don't have to be, but oftentimes it'll be a mix. So the city will have kind of its own plans for improvements that it wants to take. And those will be kind of spelled out, but they will also often, at least in communities that I've worked that have implemented this, provide for a portion of those funds to go towards like a grant fund for, say, you know, if we're talking about a downtown area and say one of the things that they want to do is like facade enhancements or beautification of the facades on those businesses. Well, they'll provide grants to business owners to go ahead and do that from those funds, because otherwise the city can't go on their property and do these improvements. So oftentimes they'll provide some for private use and the rest of it for public use.
It's a good group of downtown merchants come together, agree on facade improvements, and use the district TIF to offset taxes.
To offset taxes or the costs of those improvements. Yeah, so I mean, that's exactly what like that grant program would be. Yeah, so certainly if that would be of interest and something that Fremont was setting up, it'd be a great, if you have if the business owners in the area have a body that meets, or just even if they don't, to go around and chat with them about that sort of thing. If that want, you know, because you don't want to put it in place if people aren't going to use it. I've seen that too before, right? They just put it in place because they think it's a good idea, not really publicized. Nobody really wants to use it. So certainly you want some buy-in from the community so those funds aren't just sitting and not being used. But yeah, absolutely, you can set it up like that. So I just put an example of how this would look. I'll go through it quick. City, so let's say the city wishes to revitalize its downtown area, which is located in blighted and substandard community redevelopment area. City adopts a redevelopment plan for the entire area, which implements a district TIF program for purposes of facade enhancements, grants for storefronts like we were just talking about, upgraded sidewalk landscaping and lighting, and the creation of new public green spaces throughout the downtown area. Let's say that they pass this in 2023, And let's say in 2023, the tax revenues for all properties within the district equal $2 million. And in parentheses, I put there, so that'd be about $100 million in tax assessed valuation at a 2% levy. So let's say they want to get started on it right away. The city divides taxes beginning in 2024, which would make 2023 those base value, the base value or base year. So that's that green line on that original slide that always continues to go to the taxing jurisdictions. So, you know, moving on beyond that, so in 2024, if the assessed valuation of the properties within the district naturally increases by 2% in 24, the assessed valuation would be 102 million. And the tax revenues on that base value, so that 2 million in tax revenues on that initial 100 million base value, or that 2023 value, would continue to go to the taxing jurisdictions. The tax revenues on the 2024 $2 million increase over the base value, which equals 40,000, would go to the city to carry out the objectives or improvements in the redevelopment plan. And that would continue over the course of a 15-year TIF period. And you might think, well, $40,000, that doesn't amount to much. But I mean, that's kind of the beauty of you know, compounding or, you know, increasing interest, is that over time, if you have those, because the base value always stays the same, that's always $100 million. But if you think it's gonna, and certainly in these situations, I'll always advise my cities, don't just go off of 2%. Actually look at the data for your city to see what that natural increase has been over time and base it off of that, instead of just going off of kind of, you know, numbers that sound good. But in this, it's just 2%, because that's kind of the general rule of thumb. And as you can see, over the course of 15 years, that adds up to $5,226,394. So, yeah.
Are these records all open to freedom of information?
This is just an example that I put together, and I'd be happy to share.
No, sir, I'm talking about it, once we put it into place, like we got the chicken plant out here.
Yeah.
Okay, is that public information?
All of this is public information. Yep, and it would all be, you know, have to be approved at meetings of the public, so it'd be very public in that situation. So that just kind of shows what that can add up to over the course of time. And I've seen many cities implement this. A lot of them have been doing it for a long time, since the 90s. It's been very helpful for them for downtown revitalization, or some of those other instances that we touched on. Certainly the one thing I'd say about district TIF is obviously always chat with the school board about, you know, the school system about it. They have the biggest stake in property taxes, and especially when you are freezing it for a very large area. So you certainly want to always make sure that the schools are on board. The county always gets its 1% cut, even if, you know, when TIF is in place. So they shouldn't have too big of an issue with this. It's typically the schools who might be giving up something. Yeah.
So excuse me, I've heard people talk about structuring these development agreements so that basically the school district still gets their portion. And I'm thinking about, you know, the largest thing that our school district is concerned about is TIF for housing.
Yep.
Is that something that can be done?
Yep, I've worked with communities on that. You know, it kind of goes back to that broad discretion. So there's nothing in the law that doesn't permit it or that would cut against it. Certainly you want to structure it in a way that makes sense, and it both makes sense and is legal. But yeah, you can exclude, you know, one that I've worked on before. I've done that, where the city either gets a contribution or just, you know, continues to get those revenues. Done ones before where, you know, the bond, the levy associated with the school bond issuance, well, they can't give up those funds. Obviously, they're very much counting on it. So we implement a policy for any part of the tax levy that is related to the payoff of school indebtedness would continue going to the schools and wouldn't be divided as taxes. Something you have to work on with your county and make sure that they understand, because they're ultimately the ones handling the funds. But yeah, there are, it's certainly not outside the boundaries of the law. I think just when you get into those situations, you just got to make sure that everybody who should have a seat at the table does, and you do it in a manner that makes the most sense.
Do you most often see like a payment to the schools from the redeveloper in lieu of the property taxes, or do you more often see it excluded from the TIF amount?
Yeah, I mean, in most that I've done, it's been a mandatory contribution, which is separate from that. So I am not a TIOSA lawyer and do not claim to be. So I assume that there is a reason related to the TIOSA formula why they would rather have it that way. But yeah, in most cases, I've seen it be more of a contribution separate from that. And one of the reasons is that you don't want to make it look like the school has a stake in the projects. You don't want to kind of develop or split the taxes, and some goes to the school and some goes to the developer. I think it's just easier in a lot of senses to obligate the developer to make those payments based on a percentage back to the school. And if they don't, then they're in breach of the redevelopment contract and couldn't continue to receive their TIF. I think is just kind of the simplest way to do it without the city or the school kind of placing the burden on the developer to do that. Well, the last things I'll talk about, or the second to last thing is, are there any other questions on district TIF? I don't want to skip over it, but.
I've heard about micro TIF, but is that something that would apply in Fremont?
Yeah, so I didn't include that up here, but yeah, micro TIF, any community can implement micro TIF. And so it just depends on, I guess, your objective. So what micro TIF allows for is, kind of a lot of people's complaints with TIF, and this was one of Senator Groney's complaints who implemented this bill, was that it's not accessible to non-developers. But basically, it only makes sense to use TIF when you factor in economies of scale, because it's expensive to hire lawyers and to go through the process and all that, and which is true. It is. I mean, if you're only looking for, maybe a $30,000 benefit, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense to go through the process, because you're going to be using a lot of that up in the normal process. So it's just a streamlined process that cities have the option to either implement or not. If they do choose to implement it, it takes away pretty much all of the discretion of the city with respect to approving or disapproving TIF. It's really just, if it meets the criteria set forth in the statute, TIF is kind of automatically approved. You're not going through all of those public hearings. It's basically done administratively. The city can now put a cap on the amount of applications they accept yearly. They included that last year in the amendments, the bill that included the amendments to the community development law. But yeah, it's really just, do you think, there is a desire for that among the citizens within Fremont? Would it be used? Would it be a benefit? Obviously, it does create a little bit of more of an administrative burden on the city. So it's that balancing act, because you still have to handle the funds, you still have to pay them out on TIF nodes. So it streamlines the upfront portion of things, and obviously allows kind of access to smaller TIF amounts. But on the back end, there's still all the administrative burden that can be imposed. That's why the legislature incorporated the ability for cities to put a cap on the amount of projects that they approve for that.
What's an example? Sorry, is that the limit on micro TIF only, or all TIF?
Micro TIF. An example.
Of micro tip?
Yeah, so micro TIF is just based on, really the thing that differentiates it is there is a cap on the amount of TIF a single project can receive. So whereas in places like Omaha and Lincoln, there's a minimum amount of TIF that you can pay for. It's on the opposite side of the spectrum. They just changed those caps. They're based on what you're building, whether it's commercial, residential, or multifamily. But a good example is, say you are, you're maybe flipping houses in in a distressed area. So you're going in and revitalizing maybe a few houses where it's going to add value. It still has to add value. There's no difference in that. It's not a grant. It's based off the actual increase in valuation. But it's going to be a much smaller increase. But so it would allow that person that's maybe, doing 2 or 3 or 4 houses within an area to come in and say, look, I think this is going to increase the valuation of each of these houses by $70,000. That's $280,000 in the aggregate, which would produce, I can't do that mental math, but whatever that is times the levy rate, it's going to be, instead of hundreds of thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars, it might be $5,000 or $10,000 a year, but that can go a long way in incentivizing some of those rehab efforts. Or it could just be, it could be an individual's business, if they want to expand an existing business or something like that, where it might not be quite at the level where it makes sense to do a normal TIF.
So do we have to allow that, or if the city still wants to have the discretion? Because you said that if we do micro tip, it becomes administrative and it takes away the discretion of the city council.
Yeah, so it's your decision whether you want to implement the program.
Okay.
Once it's implemented, there is no discretion. If it meets the criteria laid out in the statute, it must be approved. So that's a good question. And micro TIF is, a lot of communities have implemented it. Many have not, for the reasons I discussed. I will be interested to talk to some of the communities that I've worked with on it to see how much it's been utilized. That's always the thing with those sorts of programs, is on their face, they sound great, and it is a good program, but oftentimes they just aren't utilized. So I'll be interested to hear if this one has been. It hasn't been around very long, so there's not a lot of data on the success of it. So enhanced employment areas, I'll touch on this real quick. So this is another completely different incentive under the community development law. What this allows for, and this was passed in the early 2000s. So governing bodies, the council can designate an enhanced employment area. And this can be within or outside of a blighted and substandard area. It can be either one. If it's inside the project, it must be included as kind of that same redevelopment plan process for TIF. It has to go kind of through that same process. And the expenses that it can cover are similar to TIF, and you can't overlap. You can't, double dip as far as those expenses are concerned. So if you're getting both TIF and EEA, you can't overlap on those expenses, certainly. If it's outside, then it can still be done, and the developer enters into a standalone contract with the city. And there's the expenses for that are a little bit different than your normal TIF expenses. They're a little more broad, which is interesting. And a few years ago, I think we read back through the legislative minutes to kind of figure out what the thought process was behind it, and we couldn't make any sense of why they chose to do it that way, but it's that way. So to designate an EA, developer must commit a certain amount of funds towards a redevelopment project or area, and must commit to a certain amount of job growth. And that number depends on the size of the county. Dodge County, it would require the creation of 10 new employees. And investment of at least 500,000 is required for a project to qualify. So, you know, probably, obviously it has to be a specific kind of project. It can't be, it's not typically going to be a residential project, I guess, unless it's a huge multifamily project that's going to create a bunch of employment. But typically it's going to be kind of be limited to a commercial or industrial sort of project. And so if a governing body designates an EEA or chooses to do so, and approves that, what it can do, and this can be, you know, in lieu of or in addition to TIF, it can levy what's called the general business occupation tax against the businesses within the area to pay for certain project costs. And typically when you're saying the businesses within the area, most often we're talking about all one development owned by one, maybe two entities or individuals. You know, where I will see a large, you know, group of business owners agreeing to it, and Jennifer and I talked a little bit about this, is shopping malls, because there's a huge incentive for to revitalize. So I have seen them get, you know, 50 different tenants to agree to it because they were all on board with the upgrades. In your typical setting, that's not going to happen. Most people don't want an extra tax levied on them, even if it is being passed through to the, you know, it's not the business paying the tax. It's the end user, the consumer of the goods or the services. But, you know, without a true incentive for that to happen, it's going to be hard to get a lot of people to agree to it. So there has to typically be an incentive to everybody within the area, whatever that might be.
Who collects the tax?
It's the city that collects the tax. So it'd be similar to like a food and beverage tax. I'm not sure if Fremont has implemented. Yep. So yep, it's a monthly tax collected by the city. Or I guess it could be quarterly. That's up to the city to decide via an ordinance.
Can we get a administration fee, processing fee out of that tax to handle the cost of collecting it?
Yes, yep. So not in the statutes, I just go off of, you know, what Omaha does and has done for a very long time. They collect an administrative fee and have not got dinged by the state auditor or anybody on it. It's very upfront about it. So, but it doesn't specifically provide that you can collect an administrative tax. But my advice on that is, so long as it's reasonable and is actually, you know, it's not going into a slush fund to fund the Christmas party. It's actually, you know, makes sense into both the size of that fee and what it's being used towards, then you're usually going to be pretty, you know, in the clear for those sorts of things. Yeah.
Is this called creeping socialism or communism to have public financing of things like this or get involved?
Yeah, I mean, it's in the eye of the beholder, I guess. But these things they're asking to be taxed, just to get this straight. This is a developer initiated incentive. So they're saying, I'm going to build this and I want to, you know, I need, just like TIF, I need a mechanism to finance it. So this just allows them another mechanism of doing it. They're saying, tax me as the owner. Like I said, it is a pass through to the consumer, but also there's a lot of taxes. Most taxes are passed through to the end consumer. And it's, you know, in this situation, I suppose it would be up to the consumer to vote with their feet if they don't want to pay with, you know, for that tax within that area. So like in Omaha, the Blackstone district, 50 different taxes on the bottom of your receipt. And one of them is an EEA tax. So if you don't want to be paying an extra 3, 4, 5% than you would anywhere else in the city, then you don't go to Blackstone. So it's just that kind of thing. But it's not the city imposing this. It's the developer asking the city to impose this to finance a project. So as far as just kind of how that is structured, So the city and developer can choose what types of items or businesses are taxed, just so long as that it's uniform across those businesses or items. So oftentimes what you'll see is a big user of these taxes are hotels. Because it's a perfect use of this tax, because most people that are staying in hotels are not citizens of the city. So it's a tax on non-residents who are the end consumers. Typically, they're not going to vote with their feet. They need somewhere to stay. The perfect example of this would be, like in Kearney, all of those big conference center. So you implement them in those hotels, but you don't implement them necessarily on like the food and beverage. You have the option. You can say, well, we just want it to be on the rooms. We don't want it to be on food and beverage or parking or retail. So you can have that kind of discretion, just so long as it's implemented, uniformly across those different use types. Yes.
We do have the restaurant tax in Fremont. Yeah, so we already have it.
Right, and that's a reason why many communities choose, when implementing these EAs, a lot of them, when they do have a food and beverage tax already in place, they say, well, we're not going to allow you to do an additional EEA tax on food and on restaurants or grocery stores or things like that.
Jody, you had a question?
Well, that was the grocery store piece, because we're going to be looking at a project, and it is one large property with multiple retail, but they're being very specific in saying, but not these people. And so I was wondering how that fit in, and you kind of described, to exclude grocery would make sense.
Yep, absolutely. That's very much allowed and pretty common to do so. So that's all I had on that. I guess I had one more. Do you want me to go into PACE or open it up to questions, or everybody can?
You're here, you can briefly go over it.
Okay.
That's the last thing on the agenda, and we'll go to any questions.
Yeah, and PACE is probably the least exciting of them all as far as incentives are concerned. So it stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy. It is a good program and what it strives to achieve, but it's just not as powerful as a tool as the others. So it's a financing tool that enables commercial developers to implement projects that will lower their operating costs by improving energy efficiency. So what that means is developers can come with a project, and if part of that project is some sort of energy efficient mechanisms, doesn't just have to be, solar panels on the roof. It could be a million different things that are considered, energy efficient, or have a longer useful life than your typical, whatever it might be, systems or, HVAC, things like that. It can be a million different things. It can be the shingles on your roof. Yeah.
Does this work integral with Biden's administration and energy, or is it separate?
No, this predates that. This was, I think this got put in place. Is that what you're asking? Did this come? Yeah. No, it predates it. I think it was put into place in 2017 or 18.
Or does it work together with that he's got now?
No, it's completely separate. So all of the tax incentives and things like that under that act are completely separate from PACE.
Okay.
And this is really implemented and administered at a local level. So it would be much different than those. So what they do is if you are implementing those improvements, and assuming the city has kind of opted in to one of these PACE programs, they can apply for the cost of those. Energy efficient items are typically more expensive than your normal, whatever run of the mill, what you can get by with sort of items. So to cost that, or to finance that extra cost, they can apply for PACE. And how that is financed is that the city will assess an additional property tax, which is almost exactly the same to like a special assessment for streets or paving when you form an improvement district and the city specially assesses it against the properties. Almost the exact same as that is what this looks like. So it's a tax in addition to property tax that the developer voluntarily wants to impose on themselves in order to finance these energy efficient improvements. One of the the primary requirements of it is that that it has to the energy efficient improvements over their useful life, the savings from that has to actually exceed those upfront costs. That's really kind of the main tenet of this, is that what you are saving over time is more than we're financing. So it's the benefits outweigh the cost, so to speak. And then those property assessments would be paid annually over the useful life of the improvements. And so those determinations, the cost savings ratio or SIR and the useful life, that's all determined by engineers and has to be submitted as part of that application process. And once the improvements are actually done. So that's all kind of very technical things that are determined by an engineer that are incorporated as part of that process. So it's not up to the city to figure those out. Yeah.
This be strictly for commercial applications, or could we maybe theorize that a homeowner selling solar in their house would that qualify?
So it allows for multifamily residential. It does not allow for single family residential. Yeah, mainly commercial. So, and the reason why I say it's maybe one of the less exciting ones. So in general, so what are the benefits of it? Because it sounds pretty milquetoast. So it provides another financing source for a project's capital stack. That's one of the most important, pieces of it. Oftentimes, developers will pair this with TIF and even get creative about how one finances the other, or the TIF revenue stream goes to, the PACE loan. And things like that. And one of the big benefit of that is that oftentimes PACE loans will provide a lower interest rate than your typical construction loan, being that the collateral on that is the property assessments, which pretty much, trump anything else. That property assessment is going to attach to the land. It's going to get paid off one way or another, 99% of the time, whether it's by the developer or by the bank. Somebody's going to end up paying that property assessment, or a different bank with the first lien mortgage interest on it. Yeah.
Do you have any instances where this really worked well?
So that third bullet point is the situation that I find it is the most beneficial. If the developer is developing something that will be like a commercially leased space that will command triple net rents. And what triple net rents means that all costs of ownership are passed on to the tenant, including property taxes and assessments. So in that case, the assessments would get passed through to the tenant. So it would actually be instead of kind of putting it, it being a nice little financing mechanism and putting money in one pocket to the other, it would be an actual revenue stream at that point. So yeah, and it mentions that in those cases, it can be an extremely good incentive for developers. Outside of that, it's really just kind of a structuring and diversifying among loans, a way to do that. And then from the city's perspective, obviously energy efficiency is always a good thing, if nothing else, because it reduces the burden on public infrastructure. So that was a ton, and I appreciate everybody hanging with me. If there are any questions, happy to answer them. Yeah.
Here, the scenario you talked about, we're right outside of the city, Fremont, we want to be annexed in, and we're looking to get sewer, water, streets. You need to hire someone like yourself to handle a project like that, and just ballpark what something like that would cost us to do that. We have several business owners in the area that would like to do something.
I'll give you, I probably need some more context on it. I'll give you a business card and we can absolutely chat. Or after this meeting, we can chat a little bit.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So that's it, going back to the start. You can only recoup your infrastructure costs like sewer, roads, sidewalks, electricity, I'm assuming.
Yeah, so those are your kind of fundamental costs. There's also the site work and improvement, so demolition, grading, things like that. But there is, it kind of just in most communities is based on precedent. So the one thing that outside of workforce housing TIF, which I didn't get into, but we'll toss that aside for another day. What you almost never can get is the hard construction costs of ground up private improvements. So from the foundation up of what you're actually building is not eligible. Outside of that, it can often just depend, like I said, on what the city's policies are. You know, some will say, you know, landscaping that's done within the lot, yeah, that's TIF eligible because it beautifies the area, even though it's on private land. It, you know, again, detracts from the chance that it might become blighted again, things like that. While others will say, no, it's on private land, it can't be. So it just depends on kind of what cities have done and always done. In my experience, it's hard to get them to deviate most times from what they've always done, but it's just pretty city dependent. And I'm not sure where Fremont falls on what, you know, on some of those costs, but
for those 15 years, it only goes up to what the actual received costs are that they submitted, right? So like, if they're paid off in like 5 years, the city's pretty clear of that agreement.
Yeah, and the amount of TIF authorized is always going to, so, you know, you make that initial calculation of, okay, how much do we think can be generated based on what it's valued now, what the future value is, times the levy rate, times 15 years. But if your TIF eligible costs don't add up to that amount, it's gonna be the lesser of that. It's gonna be your TIF eligible costs that you can receive in TIF. So a city can't and won't award you if you only have, if you think it's gonna generate 5 million in TIF based on the future valuation, but you only have $1 million in TIF eligible costs, or you're only estimating that you have $1 million. City will only award you $1 million, up to $1 million in TIF. And yes, once that, presumably, if you think it's going to generate 5 million each year and you only got $1 million in TIF, that would probably pay off in like 4 or 5 years instead of 15, and then yeah, it would be done.
And there's one area you mentioned, like if somebody was doing a renovation on a house, it's in the light area. You're like, you said something about like the exterior improvements, like structural improvements, energy efficiency improvements.
Yeah, so energy efficiency and facade enhancements above code are absolutely TIF eligible. I think what you're mentioning, so rehab projects, and I think Fremont falls in line with the TIF, if my recollection is correct, with how most cities treat it other than Lincoln, that rehabilitation of existing structures. So you're not doing infill, a new building, but you're going in and rehabbing an existing, you know, dilapidated or blighted structure, then many of those costs would be eligible. It's just when you're doing that infill ground up construction, that's when you get into the ineligible.
Granted wouldn't be covered, but I'm thinking, why wouldn't granted be covered? Because like it's gonna increase the tax rate, you know what I mean? If it's in line with the neighborhood.
Yeah, well, and it's not always just based on what increases the valuation, right? That goes into how much you think it's gonna be worth. But I think most cities draw the line at kind of fixtures and finishes when you're talking about rehab. Is kind of where the line is drawn, so up to that point, so floors, walls, redoing facade, roof, that would all be eligible on like a rehab project, but once you get into the fixtures and finishes, that's usually where they draw the line.
But then there was some contradictory information you said. Like it's only really useful if you're doing a big development because of the cost associated with getting it approved. Like having to hire you to do a renovation to get the paperwork and like it would eat up that cost. So is it?
So that, yeah.
Advantageous or not?
Well, that was, are you talking about just rehabbing a home and?
Yeah.
So that'd be a perfect use of micro TIF. So typically. The juice would not be worth the squeeze to hire somebody like me to go through the entire process. And I mean, it's something I'll never deter anybody from looking into it, but I think most of the time you'll see, okay, this actually might not be worth it. But that's why micro TIF, that'd be the perfect use of that. And when I was saying that, it was under the context of that was the reason, kind of the whole thought process behind micro TIF. Personally, I think some of the limits drawn in like Omaha, which is $50,000, I think that's too high. I think the juice could be worth the squeeze at $40,000 or $30,000. Really boils down to that they don't want more administrative burden, at least in Omaha, to handle what would come if they lower that limit, which is understandable. But it's really up to you to do the numbers or to look at, okay, what do I think I can make this worth, do that calculation and think, okay, well, if I could hire an attorney for 10,000, I think I'll get 50,000 from it. It still might be worth it. Something like, it's something just kind of a cost benefit sort of thing that you have to weigh the pros and cons on it. But I wouldn't discourage anybody from looking into it, no matter the project.
And that's going to be site specific, right? I mean.
Well, we haven't
You're
implemented,
going to a floodplain to do something that.
we haven't implemented micro TIF. The first thing is we would have to implement it.
Right.
Right, yeah. But yeah, I mean.
Yeah.
Still has to be within a blind and substandard area, even for micro TIF. So all of that criteria still applies.
Well, that was as far as like federal, FEMA, the floodplain area stuff, and that would still all. What do I say? They would still be a deterrent to putting in some of those things. I know we've got people who live south that are.
I think it depends on how the city decides to administer floodplain regulations and community development regulations. We could say we don't want to allow TIF in the floodplain because XYZ. Or we could say we do want to allow TIF in the floodplain because it will enhance flood resiliency.
Mm-hmm.
The thing we can't do in the floodplain is use any federal dollars.
That was kind of my question.
Yeah.
It's just federal is the only, and that side, but.
And any federal pass through
local
the
stuff,
state.
we
could still do that as long as we meet our floodplain regulations.
If we decided to warn it.
Exactly.
Yeah, now, our chicken plant, we brought in a lot of dirt, and if you drive by there, they're way up out of the floodplain, aren't they?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so those are things that we take into consideration too. Even though the whole town is in the floodplain, if you raise your house, then basically you're not in the floodplain. Use that definition.
It's extremely expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate part about moving that amount of dirt. Very costly.
Are there any more questions with Planning Commission, City Council? We've got another session to go into right after this.
Can we get a copy of PowerPoint?
I've got a copy. Yeah, I can share it with you.
Well, great. Well, I thank you, Jennifer, Dan, for your help setting up. Thank you, Michael, for
Thank you,
coming
Michael.
here with us. It's been a great discussion. I wanted it to be a kind of an open dialogue, and I think we accomplished that. Just to make note, the 20% that we have lighted in some standard, there's a map online, correct? That way you can. There could be.
I'm not sure if it's online, but I know we do have a map. I'll send that out to the
Available
council.
If you want to access that to see, again, where those potential, again, redevelopment opportunities would be. And again, I also note that, you know, as a city, we have options to, again, within the redevelopment planning process to put in public improvements and things that can benefit those areas as well. As well as the district TIF and the micro TIF. I think those are interesting ideas and things for us to consider, as well as the EEA. You know, we have an application, possibly will be coming forward to the city council on that. And so, again, all good things. Again, very pertinent now, and I appreciate the time that you gave. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you for having me.
Thanks.
All right, we have another item here. Number 5 is an executive session. So we have a form of the council. We'll be just doing it through the council, so. That's story. So can I get a motion to go into executive session by the city council?
I'll make motion, I mean, go into executive session for the purpose of real estate purchases and executive session necessary for the protection of the public.
Okay, a motion has been made and seconded to go into executive session for the purpose of discussing real estate purchases and for the reason that the executive session is necessary for the protection of the public interest. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, the pending motion is to go into executive session for the purpose of discussing real estate purchases for the further reason that the executive session is necessary for the protection of the public interest. Tyler, do you want to do the roll call, please?
Von Baron,
Yes.
Supra. Yeah. Jensen.
Yes.
Lathrop.
Yes.
Vaughn.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0, Mayor.
A motion to go into executive session for the purpose of discussing real estate purchases and for the further reason that the executive session is necessary for the protection of the public interest. Has been approved. Discussion will be limited to real estate purchases. No official actions or votes will be taken during the executive session. We'll now go into the conference room, and the planning commission will also attend as well here. So if you need to take a quick break, you're welcome to do so. I'll figure it myself. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think he did. Yep, that guy's wealth of knowledge.
Adjourn and by.
We are waiting for.
Get back in there. I'll second that motion.
Okay. Vote for Tyler.
Von Baron,
Yes.
Sukro.
Yep.
Jensen,
Aye.
Lathrope. Yes. Vaughn.
Yes.
Motion carried 5-0, Mayor.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Von Baron.
Yes.
Sukro. Yep. Jensen,
Yes.
Lathrope.
Yes.
Vaughn.
Yes.
Motion carried 5-0 to adjourn.
I think once more. 5:35. Ooh, gotta go.